Ora si registrerà la conferenza.
È già partita la registrazione?
Sì, mi ha detto Eliana appunto di farla partire, va
No,
bene?
facciamolo proprio a mezzogiorno quando iniziamo, perché sennò ci sono
Ok.
Ora si registrerà la conferenza.
We start to register, so
Record.
to record, so, yeah, to record. And people now is connecting because the time was 12 o'clock. In fact, I can see 10 people connected. Let's wait 1 minute and then we start.
Okay.
So I think we can start. We will have some people that will connect probably in the next minutes, but since we have only a limited amount of time and it's very late also in New Zealand, I would like to start with a very short introduction. Thank you everybody to be here. This is the second series of International Ferpi Talks. The first one was during autumn and winter, before the pandemics, before the webinar became so much overused. And now we started with the second series. We had Nick Higdon 2 weeks ago talking about civic engagement and critical media literacy. Today we have, I'm very happy to have two very important guests, Catherine Arrow from New Zealand and Toni Muzi Falconi, that is one of our members here in Ferpi. Catherine and Toni will talk about a lot of different topics. I will leave the stage in 1 minute. Just to think, we are recording the event, so everything will be recorded and then published on Ferpi website. You will be able to submit questions to the two speakers. You can do it through the chat, and I will be the moderator that will read the question to our guest. Or you can wait for the final session, that will be the Q&A session dedicated to a more interactive part and discussion. Please don't interrupt at the beginning the discussion. You should be everyone on mute. This will facilitate the discussion between Catherine and Toni. So let's start. Thank you, Catherine, to be here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank
And
you.
I leave you the stage.
Okay. Do you mind if I open up as the Italian of the two? First of all, I'm very happy to have you in this program with Biagio. I think that you are one of the most wonderful people in the world, and certainly you're one of the best professionals in the world. So you know a lot about, and we've been through this all together many, many, many times in the past, and so I'm very happy to be here with you. Unmasking or demasking the purpose, which I would begin with. If one of the first guests, probably actually the first guest of this program, I can't remember exactly, Biagio, maybe you can correct, was John Palusek.
The second, yeah.
The second, okay. John was is the first. He's very much alive and happy to be there. And he wrote a book in 1976, which is 45 years ago, which was published by the American Management Association. And it was, Will the Corporation Survive? And it was the first book which actually officially introduced corporate social responsibility in our profession, in our lives, in the lives of corporations and businesses, etc. The book is a great book. Obviously, it did not make such a big splash at the time because it was something that nobody had ever heard about. But today is a very interesting book, and you can make a comparison between that book and what happened then, the nil that happened then, and the enormous roars of laughter which happened in the same country last year when the Business Roundtable presented its corporate purpose statement. And basically in this corporate purpose statement, according to the editor of the statement, who was Mr. Gorski, who's the CEO of none other than Johnson & Johnson, actually told the New York Times that while he was writing this corporate purpose, he felt very much like Jefferson, who, as you know, Catherine, and I'm sure my colleagues know, was the author of the American Constitution. And this was the last time I heard of the Business Roundtable since. So the corporate purpose, in my view, from my seeing it from here, from this experience, and comparing this with what came out or what didn't come out from the John Palusek book back 45 years ago, I don't think we've made much progress. Have we?
I think that the notion of corporate social responsibility has changed over the years. I mean, during the 80s and 90s, it morphed and it assumed the mantle really of mission and visions, and then it retrenched in the 2000s. And when we went through the global financial crisis, again, it took on a new cloak. But I think 2016 was probably the turning point in terms of this direction towards organisational and corporate purpose, because there were a great deal of retrenching went on because markets had fractured. And in 2016, we saw a lot of political ideologies shifting, and that opened some fissures in the accepted leadership norms. And there was a great deal of talk at that time as to whether, because of a vacuum in leadership variously across the world in different circumstances, at that point, the organisation, the business, and I mean, when I'm talking about organisations, I'm referring generally to businesses as well, that they needed to take a role and become more of the corporate citizen, if you like, And I think that that was a point at which we saw the idea and the notion of corporate purpose as something central, not just to the identity of the organization, but to its focus really come into play. But one of the difficulties that I can see, and I think that this is where the unmasking of intent comes in, is that the roundtable discussion that you were referring to, there was the declaration that what they were going to do was going to be in the interest of all of their stakeholders inside and outside the organisation, society as a whole, and so on. But corporate purpose and organisational purpose are split into two roads. So there's the organisation that still sees purpose as something that is central to what they do, but it's a means to make a profit still. So although there's a wider purpose to what they want to do, the motivation is still profit. Whereas there's the other road for organizational purpose, and that is intent on the meeting the needs and expectations of the communities that they're serving. And if a profit is made, then that's good, and it's helps to make the organization sustainable, but it's incidental to their reason for being. And I think that where we are now, as people are trying to come to terms with the huge and rapid shifts that we've seen in the last 6 months or so, they haven't yet decided which road they're on. A lot of organizations haven't really got the hang of that yet.
Can you cite some organizations that you know and that we all know that are either on one side or on the other side, where profit is a reason or profit is not a reason for the corporate purpose?
Well, I think I can't give you a definite understanding from inside their organization as to what their declared intent is. But I mean, there's been in evidence over the last few months, particularly organizations that, I mean, Amazon, for example, was a signatory to that business roundtable. And they've been, if their declaration of purpose was to be aligned. Sorry?
They don't make profits. Amazon does not make profit.
No, but in terms of the conduct of the organization, yeah, their intent is to align themselves with that declaration, but the reality of their actions during the course of the last few months have seen people resign, whistleblowers, the treatment of employees, and so on. So it's the organization that does what it says it's going to do. It does what it says on its tin, and is true to that, as opposed to the organization who talks a good game, but then they don't fulfill the things that they've said. And I think that that's the difference. And I'm sure that in Italy, here, elsewhere in the world, there have been examples on both sides. But where we as practitioners get involved is helping them to make sure that their behaviours are in keeping with their declared purpose and intent, and that their story isn't a fairy tale, it's grounded in some truth.
Yes, yes. Well, I don't quarrel with that. I think you are perfectly right, and I know that there are some cases of organizations, I would call them, more than businesses, because we have to do with a lot of other organizations. For example, public sector organizations that have the same issue, or social sector organizations who also have the same issue. Profit is not necessarily what they're after, at least officially. They would never say so if they were non-profit. But they also are playing games as well as public organizations by making very bold statements about their purpose, their intents, and then often, not always, of course, behaving differently. So I think that if we came down to the guts of it, we would all have probably different ideas on who the candidates for the goods companies or organizations are, but we can easily select some that we believe are. Now, the point is that if we go, what is our role in this? Are we there as gatekeepers? Are we there as facilitators? Are we there as persuaders? Are we there as motivators? What are we doing with these organizations when we are working with them? What is your opinion on that?
I think that it's the second time this week that somebody's asked that question, and my you know that my belief is that what we do is our purpose is building and sustaining the relationships that we need to keep our license to operate, that social license to operate. And part of doing that work is the relationship components of trust, mutuality, loyalty, commitment, understanding, reputation. And our role is helping to foster those relationships. And in doing that, it's supported by, I couldn't visualize it as an atom. So if you've got relationships as the center of the atom, then around that, you've got communication, you've got behavior, and you've got understanding, supporting all of those things. And frequently, our role is confined to the element of communication, and that's it. But you can't have a good relationship without effective communication, whether that's written, oral, visual, or experiential. And in confining our role to that single element, where we wouldn't be in a position to undertake the purpose, which I believe is ours to do and has been historically, and that's to help the organisation fulfil its purpose and help it to ensure that the intent is genuine and that it undertakes its purpose in an ethical way. So it's that looking inside and outside the organisation. Part of our role in that is bringing, as you know, I always think of it as our superpower, is the bringing of situational intelligence to the organisation, so that when they're considering their decision making, when they're developing their strategies to undertake what they do, they've got the right information upon which they can base their decisions. And we as listeners for the organisation help them to come to those decisions in a balanced way. And that, to me, is our role in this, is helping the organisations fulfil its purpose by building those relationships that it needs, helping those people by listening in both directions, and then facilitating the progress forwards. That's, and
say both directions, what do you mean?
Sorry?
When you say both directions, what do you mean?
Inside and outside the organisation. Yeah. So you're not listening just to the external stakeholder or the external communities. You're very much listening inside the organisation to ensure that what's happening is true to what's being reflected to the leadership. I think it's something that lends itself more to flatter structures within organisation. If they're operating in closed systems, or if it's a tight hierarchical structure, or if it's based on the systems of profit that we've seen develop from, 16th century onwards, that's not always going to work, and that's where you get the friction between. So I think it's an interesting tension now. I think it's a challenging tension, because for so long, so many in our role have been confined to that element of communication. But it's beyond that. You can't have a good relationship. You can't help to build a reputation without the communication, but it's got to be balanced by behavior. And if the behavior is not there, the attitudes, the effect that the organisation has on those around it, on society, and the society understands, then you're stuck.
Yeah. Well, you focused quite a lot on the listening part of the of our role, and that of course brings up an enormous can of worms, as we know, because there are many ways in which we say we listen. There are many ways in which we listen, and there are many ways in which we fail to listen, and obviously there are many ways to approach this issue. As you know, my position is, together with Biagio, Oppi, we have created a group that is permanently discussing in Bologna this listening issue, and we have more or less structured a shall we call it active listening rather than just listening, and that implies, of course, all stakeholders, internal and external, and what we call the boundary stakeholders, which are, for example, suppliers, just to give you, or consultants, just to give you another example. Now, the active listening part that we are trying to achieve in our work in this country, but not only in this country, in a lot of countries, has to do with analysis, research, dialogue, etc. Last week, our association, Ferpi, had a very interesting discussion with one of the leaders of the research industry in this country, in which he accepted the idea that all of the basic paradigms by which a sample was representative, according to what we learned in school when we learned about research, are all gone. They don't exist anymore, and that basically research forms the opinions of those who make the decisions. So basically, research, market research, opinion research, whatever research you want to call it, it's a big industry in this country. I think it's I read the other day, I don't like what I read normally, so I don't think that this is true, but if it is true, it's interesting. We are the ones that make more research in Europe. Now, this is true, but I don't believe it's true, of course, because if it was, we wouldn't be so awfully positioned today compared to the rest of Europe if we did research. But we don't do research, we do polls, and which is a completely different thing from research, and that is very important. I'm sure you agree with this. What would you say on that?
I think that the research that we do as a profession, I would like to think is beyond polls. I think that when we're researching, listening is absolutely a critical part of that. If we just content ourselves with polls, then we're not going to bring the kind of information that anybody can base any kind of decision making on, because it's not true, and it wouldn't come with the right intent. It wouldn't necessarily reflect what people are actually saying and doing. I mean, part of the research that we would do has to cover not just the stakeholder opinions, but also, I mean, particularly in these times that we're in now, we have to see how people are feeling. What's their emotional state? You know, where are they in terms of need, and that need being met? So it goes beyond a poll. And whilst a poll makes a fast headline, or it might seem to facilitate or confirm somebody's opinion about something, it's not necessarily sufficiently balanced or instructive for it to fulfill or inform any kind of organizational purpose. So whilst the research industry may use similar tools, they're certainly used in different ways for different purposes. Does that make sense?
Yes, but as the whole research profession is abruptly changed over these last few years, as our friend that I was citing before admitted and confessed, shall we say. Basically, the roles are coming closer more and more, because if it is true that the researcher role is to form opinions of others, decision makers or politicians or industry leaders and so on, it is our role as well to do that. Or is it not? Because we had some discussion about this when we spoke. I like your take, and I would like you to say what you think about this, because I and a lot of my colleagues probably think that our role is to form the opinions of others.
And well, I suppose I would have to disagree with that, because I think there are plenty of people around who could do that, who could inform the opinions of others, influence, persuade, manipulate. All of those things can be done, but I don't necessarily agree that that's what we do. And I'll stick to that until my end. I think what we do, when you're forming a relationship, you have to bring an opinion, you have to bring a perspective. But I think when you are truly listening and you're truly researching, then you're informing the organizational purpose, and you can say, it may be that this is the opinion that you might keep as an organization, but it's not necessarily going to foster or build the relationships you need in order to fulfill your declared purpose. So as part of our role, it may be that we have to contradict the opinions of the organization to say, in this instance, this is at fault. So it's not about research and opinion gathering to change others' minds. There needs to be an honesty to it. My question mark, if you like, is that where organizations are declaring their organizational purpose, none of that will work if their intent isn't genuine, and if they're using social purpose as a masquerade for doing what they've always done, but just doing it with a different hat on.
How do I test this? This is a period in which we are all testing ourselves against COVID. How do I test myself against doing exactly what you just described before? How can I avoid doing this?
Avoid the opinion forming, or avoid
the fact of being basically dishonest with myself, my mirror, my colleagues, when I try to convince somebody else of something that has nothing to do with my purpose, if that is the case.
My short answer was that if it's not to do with your purpose, then you shouldn't be trying to persuade them to do something else.
And if it has to do with the purpose?
If it has to do with the purpose, then if you have a perspective that you want to share with your stakeholders, then your role there is to develop understanding of your perspective, but also understanding theirs. I've mentioned him before, but you know Tim. You remember Tim Marshall? Tim Marshall is one of our life members, and he is our go-to ethics person. And one of his favorite quotes is that public relations operates where issues collide. Yeah. And I always think, and I've told you this before, my mental image of what we do is, if you remember in the 1960s, you have a lava lamp where you plug the lamp in and it's got wax inside, and it heats up the wax, and then that turns into spheres that interact with each other. And sometimes that wax spins into a block, and then it dissipates and turns into lots of little bubbles. And that's really where we are. We're operating in those spheres as they heat up and cool down, and the issues around us collide. So organizational purpose may be to move something forward, whether it's public good, whether it's an organization, a business, whatever it might be. But if your purpose and your intent is good, but it's not necessarily, it's colliding with other interests, then our role there is to facilitate understanding and create a bridge between the organisation and those with whom they're colliding, so that you can go forward together. And I think in the situations that we're in now, and where you're talking about how do we test ourselves, I think we have to test ourselves to make sure that we're not just being functionary, we're not just being given tasks, sending them out, yes, go and change these people's minds, because ultimately the organisations will cease to be relevant anyway, because our expectations as individuals, and I think as humans around the world, the experience has been such that there's a shared expectation from those around us. It's either a deep disappointment or a shared expectation that it will improve. And if, as practitioners, we don't have the courage to step up and fulfill that purpose of the relationship building and the bridge building, then we'll have a little chatbot do our job instead.
Well, as you no, you wouldn't, because you don't read Italian. But if you read today's Corriere della Sera, the Italian, the most important, or at least I don't know if it's important anymore. Anyway, I have no opinions on newspapers any longer, nor on myself either. But there was an article which said that one of our colleagues, very important colleague, did a press conference yesterday, or video, one of these Zoom things, like we're doing now, in which they presented the role of artificial intelligence in a reputation, in measuring a reputation. And I tried to read, and I didn't understand very much what it was all about, and I promised to myself that I would do it. But we are now emerging, so-called emerging, or at least we are still deeply immersed in an enormous, how would you say, fear. And this fear has nothing to do with COVID-19. This fear has to do with poverty, has to do with the loss of privileges, has to do with the loss of prestige, has to do with the loss of size of our country compared to other countries which are similar, including, obviously, Latin America, South America, Central America, South Africa, whatever. I mean, every country is better off than we are. I'm sure my colleagues would not appreciate this and would not agree with this, and I exaggerate. But New Zealand appears to be something special compared to most other countries. And you've been there now for a hell of a long time. Tell me more. I mean, I love New Zealand. I've been to your country 2 or 3 times over the last 30 years or something. Tell me more how your profession is holding up in your country.
My colleagues in the public sector have been absolutely phenomenal. They have worked so hard and they have achieved great things, really. I've watched in admiration as they've worked hard to bring together, not just with public communication. It's very easy to just speak at people, to tell people stuff and hope that they'll oblige. In the UK, they've got the behavioural units, designed to nudge people along. In our circumstance here, the thing that made the biggest difference was that there was a relationship involved, and the communications that came about were absolutely around communication and building the relationship, not just telling people you must stay home, you must do this, you must do that, but people trusting each other sufficiently that they were willing to collectively do what was necessary to make a difference. And it was reciprocated trust. So from the government perspective, when they were bringing in the economic support measures and that sort of thing, our Minister for Treasury, Grant Robertson, said, we're operating this on a really high trust model. We're not going to interview people, so you get the help, you just fill in the form and it will be in your account, you know, in the next couple of days. If you don't do it right, if you're unfair and you don't treat your people properly and you misuse this money, we'll come after you. But we won't come after you right now, but we will come after you eventually. But everything was mutual, you know. And one of the things that's causing great friction here at the moment is our borders are closed to everybody apart from returning citizens and residents. And a couple of people, I mean, 30,000 people have been through quarantine since the borders closed. And 3 people took it on themselves to do a runner. So 3 out of 30,000, I don't think is bad odds, really. But it's caused all sorts of mayhem because people feel generally that they've let everybody else down. Their reckless action puts at risk everything that we've tried to do together. And that was why, I mean, our health minister went for a bike ride. In our lockdown, we were only allowed to go in our immediate neighbourhood, and he went off for a bike ride, which was a car ride away, and he did something else as well. So people felt that he'd let everybody down because it was a collective effort. And I think that we are a small country. There's only 5 million of us, but it was the relationship and the support for each other, which was manifest in other countries around the world. But I think because the country acted early, because it was really clear from the outset, look, this is the situation that we're in. We could make an economic response, but we're not going to do that because too many people will die, and that's unacceptable to us. So they said, we're going to fix it as a public health crisis, then we'll try and sort out the economy. Everybody's going to have problems with the economy, but if we can stop yo-yoing in and out of it, then we've got a better chance. And I mean, tourism is our lifeblood here, tourism and agriculture, and we have no tourists, you know? So it's a really big call to do that. But I think we were fortunate because I think we had the right leaders in the right place at the right time. I mean, from a great Prime Minister, a really good cabinet, public health officials who are experts, and the public relations and communication professionals that work in government and in the public sector were superb. So I think we were very blessed. You know, it could have been quite different with different people in the makeup and the setup of it.
I don't know what my colleagues think about the situation here. I'm sure we have lots of overlapping opinions and then lots of different opinions, so I won't even attempt to describe my opinions on the situation here. They are so terrible in general. To arrive, I think Biagio is getting a little bit nervous because I think he wants to open the discussion. He hasn't given me a sign, but I know him.
No. You can go on, no problem.
Okay.
We can go on.
We can go on. One thing that I am very interested in knowing is your concept of listening and situational listening, shall we put it that way, or situational thinking, because you elaborated on it in a couple of things that I read, and I thought that was very interesting, and I'm sure that my colleagues are interested in listening to your opinions on that. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, so just to talk about approaches to it. Yeah. Well, I think it's identifying who your communities are to start with, identifying your communities of interest, your stakeholder groups. I mean, I'm a big fan of Robert Heath's notion of state seekers, or stake seekers rather than stakeholders. So those who would like to be involved with your organisation, but for whatever reason aren't. determining who your advocates might be, but also your adversaries, to see why, what's the reason that they don't want you to do what you do, so that you can develop an understanding of the different perspectives that are out there. A good research program that puts into place an opportunity to talk with them, gathering that data, making sure that it's understood and that the meanings are shared, because sometimes when we go out into a listening situation or a research process, we go into it with different meanings. So, I mean, if I went out and asked a group of people, you know, how what's the most relaxed you can be about something, their notion of being relaxed would be quite different. For some, it might be going for a run. For some, it might be having a glass of wine and some chocolate. You know, that establishing where there is shared and unshared meaning is very valuable when you're thinking about listening. And it also helps you when you can collate and bring all that information to listen outside your own sphere, your own bubble of activity, to be sufficiently informed as to what the rest of the world is doing and what effect those conditions and those activities will have on your people, on your communities, so that you're not listening in isolation. You're listening to what else might affect those people with regard to your interaction with them, but then the interaction of others too. All of that together, when you put it together and then analyze what's happening, gives you the opportunity then to bring some a good assessment of the situation and a good assessment of the people with whom the organization wants to bring forward relationships and build them, to activate that and put it into play.
I'm very proud of an achievement that you and I have done together. In the last 41 minutes, we have not mentioned digital. I think that is a tremendous achievement. I don't know if my colleagues agree with me, but still, not that I'm against the digital, and I know you are not against digital. If anything,
No.
very much one of the very first movers in digital, I can remember very well. But how do you see the situation today? I mean, I remember 30 years ago when you and I were attempting to be digital long before it became a popular theme. What is your position towards digitalization today? Have you changed your mind? Have you modified your approach? Obviously you have, but which ways?
I think it's our life. You know, it's like air. It's part of a vast shared experience. It enables people to connect like this. I mean, the pleasure of being able to speak with you and to have your colleagues there, that's such a privilege. And over these last few months, particularly, that ability to connect with people in that way, I think we would have been quite lost without it. One of the difficulties is obviously the nastiness that's arisen, and the way that language is used, and the way that people are not as patient or tolerant of each other. But I think to a great extent that's been instigated by the way that people in leadership positions have used the platforms. So it's spread its own virus in that regard. But I mean, many of the things that we've talked about, the listening, the research and so on, fundamental to that is using digital tools and means to undertake those processes. So it's an enabler to the way that we do things, but we also have to remember that it's not the only way of doing something. I mean, when we think about the way various communities around the world have had to try and reach out to people in remote locations to help them to understand about the virus transmission and so on, and they've used some really creative and very real human connection means to do that. Digital is a real human connection, but it's I think we have to be careful because the organizations, and I mean, we talk about organizational purpose at the beginning, the organizations that have the power and the control over the digital platforms also have great influence, and they also have great influence and means to shape people's opinions in very much the way that you were talking about from the market research perspective. And therein lies the danger, because they will, you know, we have case after case of confirmation bias and extremism and so on, but it's fed by an algorithm. And a bad algorithm doesn't exist. Bad training exists for algorithm, bad data exists, and bad intent. So that's where I think we have to be so careful. And we have to take some kind of responsibility and tackle that as a problem, because it's going to fuel other societal problems. It's going to increase the inequities and the disadvantages that you've touched on. That if we don't, I mean, when the Global Risk Index has had inequity as its top risk for years, you know, and we have to address that. We have to. It's wrong to let that continue. And maybe if people have good organizational purpose and a decent algorithm, we can do something to fix it. I hope so.
Yes. Biagio, I have a lot of other questions, but I don't want to take anybody else's role.
But at the moment, we didn't receive a question, actually. I have some that I have written down during the discussion. If someone wants to try to make some question, it's enough to ask and send a text on the chat. Regarding Catherine and Toni, both, regarding the listening part, no? During the pandemic, most of the organizations started this kind of remote working. So people working from home, not attending daily the office and the place of work in the traditional way. It was something that in some countries was already advanced process that was already in place since years. But now we found ourselves out of the offices for several weeks and months. Do you think is going to change the relationship between the organization and their employees, this kind of new situation, new normality? Because we are going to enter a new normality, as is called, that probably will leave some people at home and no more in the office. It's something that also my organization is thinking about. A lot of other organizations declared that till the end of the year, no offices will be used. And what I see is that also the internal stakeholder of the organization are starting to leave their own bubble, as we see a bubble in the social media. So people attending, people that think the same things and that are on the same topics and live the same way of life. Now in the organization, it seems that we are risking to enter this new era of silos and distancing that is not only physical but also social. What do you think about this thought that is something that probably we have to address as communicator and public relation professionals?
I think that's at the beginning, or before we sort of launched straight into the pandemic. One of the things that I wrote about was the absolute vital role for the internal communicator, because if we're thinking about our role as building relationships, those relationships aren't simply those outside the organizations, they're inside, and everything that we do has to be inside out. So the role of the internal communicator isn't going to be task-based or sharing of information. It's going to be about developing the relationship and a culture that can operate where you've got people dispersed across a geographical network. But the fundamental culture of the organization, if people are brought together to understand the purpose of what's being done and why it's being done, and there are the use of digital tools or whatever mechanisms necessary to bring people closer together to avoid that silo, because it's easily done, it's easily slipped into. But communication not as a task-based operation, but internal communicators as the facilitators of relationship and organizational culture. And I think that will help, because so many organizations, if they are able to continue doing what they do in different environment that we're moving into, they're going to have to revise their culture. They're going to have to look at a very different way of doing things. It's one of the things that worries me is it's a little like we've all been reading a book, for the last however many years, and we've got to a particular chapter and we've had this great dramatic thing happen in the chapter. Now we're in a new chapter, or the beginning of a new chapter, and instead of writing it fresh, a lot of people and organizations are trying to get the stuff from other chapters and shove it into this new one and make it fit. Or it's like if you remodel your home and you take all the walls down and then you try and fit everything back in, and it's not going to fit, it's not going to work. Similarly with the organization, if they try and replicate the type of organizational culture that they had previously, then it's not going to be a good read. It's not going to work as a place to be. But if they're brave enough to say, we've got to rethink this, let's rethink it together, then they're going to facilitate a culture change and help people through the change of operation. So I think internal comms, always vital, never more so than now.
That's very, very relevant that you say this, because clearly there is at least in this country, there seems to be a lot of attention towards changing the culture of organizations. The problem we find, as you know, I work for a company, or I have worked, or I'm still working for a company that does this for a living, a so-called living. It's much more difficult and complicated than just changing the message. Let's put it that way. And the reason for this is because we are talking about achieving objectives, and very often the definition of the objectives that you want to achieve inside an organization are somewhat hazy. Let's put it that way. The paths towards the achievement are somewhat hazy because there are obviously different opinions by those who should be in charge of the purpose, and whatever you want to call it, purpose, subjective, etc. My personal, but I don't want to speak for my colleagues, my personal opinion is that we need to do things internally and externally, and internally, externally, and also on the boundaries, because there are so many people that we don't consider as influencers who influence. And not only are these, as I was saying before, the ones on the boundaries, stakeholders, or whatever you want to call them, but there are a lot of people from outside who influence. You mentioned before the role of the big technology companies. Technology companies have a role in organizations that they never had 20 years ago. And today, all they need is to change a little feature of Microsoft Teams, for example. And the whole company needs to adapt to this. It is basically, the company is in the hands of the technology companies. Because if the technology companies decide to change and to add or to take away one feature, the whole internal communication structure tends to change, tends to fall down. Obviously, if the technology changes, it doesn't necessarily mean or imply that the content changes. But you know better than I do that this is never true. When the technology changes, the content bloody well changes as well. We've done this, we've tested this thousands of times. Yes, sorry. Go ahead.
Tony, we have a question from Joe. Joe, Joe Fox, are you there? Can you speak?
Sure. Hi. Thanks so much, Catherine and Tony.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Is this okay?
Yes.
Fine, great. Been a really interesting discussion, and I'm just working towards the end of a book on PR as masquerade, so I was very interested in the topic for today. It's perfect. Unmasking and the creation of the mask in culture and PR's role in that. And my sort of urgency for writing it is the sense that really the only purpose anybody has at this moment is the survival of the planet. And it's really hard, if you take that perspective, to see how this quarter's results may or may, they just look so petty compared to the big issues that confront us. And I know Catherine has written about this in a blog recently. Anyway, I'm just interested in whether you agree and whether you think public relations can facilitate such a change of purpose. Excuse me.
Tony?
Thank you, Joe.
You go ahead. Go ahead.
I think it can and I think it should, but I don't know if it will. That's my honest answer. I think we have the ability to do it. I think we have the competencies. Your work in that field. We certainly have the competencies and the abilities, but I don't know how far beyond task orientation we've got, and I don't know how brave people will be if they feel that it will jeopardize the remaining job that they have. I mean, given that the jobs will be in short supply, well, let's just all be brave and go for it. If we can do it, let's do it. So my answer is yes, I think we can and we should, but whether we will or not, I don't know. I would hope that we would, and I would hope organisations like Ferpi and CIPR and PRINS and others would equip practitioners with the knowledge and skills that they need to take that on. And I think we'd be doing a disservice by not doing so, but we'd have to see.
You're right. I agree with what you say. I am also rather skeptical as to where we're going. Not that Prince or Ferpi are not doing anything in this area. I'm not saying this. They can do much more, of course. We can all do much more than we are doing. But the point is that we have only recently, compared to the decades in which we've been around, at least physically, we have only recently realized that the survival of the planet is really at stake. And maybe not many of us are actually so sure that this is happening. And if this is happening, maybe it's another purpose statement, masquerade, as Joe would say. I think that we are giving inequality delaying, taking it easy, slowing down, all these things which seem absolutely reasonable from any perspective. And certainly the environment, obviously, we're taking these things very, very not serious. I remember last year in Blade, or was it 2 years ago? I can't remember. Dejan Vercic made a scathing report on the status of our profession around the world, talking about, for example, the climate issue. I was terrified when I heard it, but then 2 days later, I had forgot what it was all about. This is my fault, obviously, it's not Dejan's fault. But basically, we don't see, because we're not honest with ourselves enough. When we look at ourselves in the morning when we shave, if we are men, or do something else, if we're women, lipstick, whatever, we are not sufficiently self-critical. And this is terrible because we are a terrible example for the younger generation, and the younger generation is probably much worse than we are. That's my opinion.
I think from a practitioner perspective, the environmental consideration, I mean, when the Rio summit was held, I remember speaking with clients and talking with them about the need. I mean, the refrigerant was the big issue at that particular point because we'd got the hole in the ozone layer. But organizations weren't willing to change because their motivation was still absolutely about profit. So even though we'd done all of the situational intelligence, even though we'd done all of the listening, they would not change because it did not suit their agenda at the time, and their purpose was profit. I think that of the role, going back to Joe's question, we have to speak louder. We have to have, I mean, I've always said this, the biggest competency as practitioners that we need is courage. And that's the courage to speak out and speak up. And you know, the cliche of speaking truth to power now, it has to be done. I mean, the immediacy of the environmental challenges that exist have to be addressed. And we're suffering through a pandemic at the moment, but the other problems are still there. So, yeah. You know.
So it's 1 o'clock here in Italy. It's 1 hour that we are talking, and Catherine is very late in the night. I want to thank her with this great message that she leaves us, that one of the most important things for the practitioner is the courage to speak out. I think that anyone can agree on this point. Thank you, Toni.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. It was great.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
This webinar has been recorded and will be online in few days. Next Ferpi Talk, International Ferpi Talk, will be in 2 weeks about diversity and inclusion. So another topic that is quite urgent to be addressed also by our profession. Thank you and goodbye. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you, Catherine.
Bye. Thank you both. Bye.
Bye bye. Mary, can you stop? Thank you.